Welcome to part 3, the final part for our 100mm focal length for the SLR Lounge Canon Lens Wars series. Now, since we had a total of 9 lenses in this grouping, in the first video we compared just the 3 100mm primes and we came up with our 2 favorites. In part 2 we compared the 6 different zoom and telephoto lenses that covered the 100mm focal range and came up with our 2 favorites on that side. And in this video we're going to compare our favorites from both part 1 and part 2 to come up with an overall conclusion for the 100mm focal length. For those that are new to the SLR Lounge Canon Lens Wars series, be sure to check out the teaser video where we introduce the entire series, we talk about our testing methodology, and check out all the other videos and articles as well on each focal length on slrlounge.com. Now this is the 100mm focal length conclusion, and we have a total of 9 lenses that originally fit into this grouping. In the last 2 videos, we reviewed the 3 100mm primes and we came up with these 2 as our favorites, and we reviewed the zoom and telephoto lenses in part 2. We came up with the 2 70-200s as our favorites as well, the 70-200 2.8s. So overall, here is our lens setup. We have the 100mm f2, we have the 100mm f2.8 macro, we have the 70-200 f2.8L, and this is the non-IS version, and then we have the 70-200 f2.8L IS Mark II. Now, one thing to remember before we get started is that in the 100mm primes, the 100 f2.8L macro is indeed a macro lens, and it has a 12-inch minimum focus distance. So function-wise, just remember that it's a bit different from the rest of these lenses because this lens can do macro photography while none of the others have that ability. Okay, so let's start from the top with their overall aesthetic quality and sharpness at their respective WOAs or wide open apertures. And once again, this is a visual test of differences and not a technical one. So we're trying to distinguish differences in appearance while simply viewing the images at full screen on a 27-inch 3K resolution display. And I'll be honest, it was actually rather difficult telling the difference between these 4 lenses, at least visually. I did notice that the 100mm f2 expectedly did have a bit more bokeh at its wide open aperture of f2 compared to, say, the other lenses, which were all at f2.8. But while I could distinguish the difference and the additional amount of bokeh on my 3K display, it wasn't a major difference. And it was kind of hard to tell between the images, especially compared to the 100mm f2.8 macro, which was very similar. The only way really for me to tell the difference easily between the 4 images was to compare them side by side, specifically to the area left of our model. And to that area, you could basically see slightly more bokeh in the 100mm f2 compared to the other lenses, but you can see how similar the other lenses are. Now, I did notice that both of the 70-200s, they did have less bokeh than the f2.8L macro, as well as the standard 100mm f2, but it was really a case of splitting hairs. And in talking about their sharpness at their WOAs, both the 70-200s and the 100mm f2.8L macro, they had virtually identical performance. It was noticeable that the 100mm f2 was slightly softer at f2, but again, at f2 the 100mm was still completely usable, just a bit softer than the other 3 lenses. However, all 3 L series lenses, the 100mm f2.8L, the 70-200s, they did have noticeably better contrast, better color than, say, the 100mm f2. But I do have to say that I'm impressed with all 4 of these lenses. All of them are quite amazing in terms of their image quality and visual appeal. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring them all up to their WCA, or their widest common aperture of f2.8, and see if the visual differences between the lenses are as noticeable. Now at f2.8, all the lenses kind of appeared to equalize, at least for the most part visually. I could still tell that the L series lenses, they had a bit more color, a bit better contrast than, say, the 100mm f2, but trying to tell the difference between each lens in terms of bokeh and sharpness really became quite difficult without zooming in. And even when zoomed in, the differences were extremely minor. I was able to catch slightly less sharpness in the 100mm f2 compared to, say, the other lenses, but again, it was just a tiny amount of basically splitting hairs. It was a very small type of difference. Edge sharpness at f2.8 was roughly pretty equal across the board. However, it did look like the 100mm f2 pulled slightly ahead of the crowd, as you can see towards the right side of the model in the branch. Again, from f4 to f5 and beyond, really all the lenses were pretty visually equal, with the exception of, once again, better contrast and color out of the L series lenses than versus, say, the standard 100mm. Edge sharpness on all lenses was again pretty solid, but again, the f2, the 100mm f2 seemed to just be a bit more crisp, although to be honest, it was tough to see visually without doing zoomed in side-by-side comparisons. Okay, so all the lenses in this comparison are absolutely solid. So what's the final conclusion? Well, again, this isn't necessarily fair to say because most of the lenses in this grouping, they have their own merits and functionalities. But if I were to speak strictly aesthetically at this focal length, then despite the fact that it has slightly less contrast and color, I would probably go for the 100mm f2 over the other lenses. But again, here's the thing, and we mentioned this earlier in the previous video. When you're comparing the primes, the 100mm f2 is a portrait lens. It doesn't have close-up macro functionality, and that means it doesn't really compare to the 100 f2.8 macro. So this really means that it competes more with the 85mm grouping and the 85 portraits, not the macro lenses. And that being said, between say the 85mm 1.8, it has slightly better low light performance at 1.8 versus 2.0. In addition, it creates slightly more bokeh at 1.8. Also, I find the 85mm focal length just a bit more convenient for my shooting style for portraits than compared to 100mm at f2. So again, I would choose the 85 1.8 over the 100mm f2, or if you have the budget, go for the 85 1.2 over the 100mm f2 focal length. But both the 85mm lenses are going to give you a bigger difference in overall looks, performance, and low light sensitivity when compared to the other lenses in the 100mm focal length. So in addition, the 85 1.8 is also a bit less expensive as well, but both lenses are close to the $500 mark, which makes them great values. Now, if you need a macro lens, then your best option is going to be the 100mm f2.8L. The L version of the 100mm macro is just over $1,000, while the non-L version, or the standard version without stabilization, is $600. Again, given the difference in price isn't absolutely ginormous, it's not 4 or 5 times more, I would go with the L version because it is far superior in functionality and it'll also give you better image quality. Now, while the 100mm f2.8L aesthetically was probably my second favorite in this final comparison, the difference between it and the 70-200s was really a matter of splitting hairs. It was incredibly tough to differentiate even when we were zoomed in doing side-by-side comparisons. And the only reason I own or would recommend purchasing the 100mm f2.8L macro is simply because it's a macro lens. But if you don't need the functionality, if you don't need that macro functionality, then both of the 70-200s are going to give you virtually identical image aesthetics and quality, maybe slightly behind, but it's going to be really unnoticeable. And they're also going to be more versatile in their focal length and function. So my final recommendation, the 70-200 f2.8L IS Mark II and the non-IS 70-200 f2.8L are right up there when it comes to their aesthetic quality, the amount of bokeh, the quality of the bokeh, the overall performance, image quality, contrast, color, and so forth as the 100mm primes. And depending on your budget, the $2,500 70-200 Mark II with image stabilization would be my first choice. And my second choice would be the non-IS version at $1,500. If you also need a macro lens, then pick up the 100mm L because for around $1,000, it isn't a huge leap in cost from the standard 100mm f2.8, and it will be better all around. Now, when it comes to that low light kind of uber bokeh out prime that you need to have, well, follow my suggestion and stick with one of the 85mm lenses. Particularly the 85 1.8 is cheaper than the 100 f2. It's going to give you a bit better low light performance, more bokeh, roughly the same image quality, and it's going to give you more versatility in your lens arsenal than rather having another lens at 100mm. Also, when you're ready to sell and say move to the 85 1.2, the 85 1.8 is going to be an easier sell than the 100mm f2. I hope you all enjoyed this conclusion to the 100mm focal length in the SLR Lounge Canon Lens Wars series. Be sure to check out the actual article by clicking the link in the description below the video for more example images, more information on each lens, as well as links on where you can purchase. My name is Pye, and I'll see you all in the next video.